Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. In this episode, I am joined by Michael A. Giovine, who is Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at Westchester University, Director of its Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology and Museum Studies program, and Director of the Ethnographic Field School on Sustainable Food and Cultural Heritage in Perugia, Italy. So the episode that was dropping today was recorded in preparation for the canonization of Carlo Acutis. And we woke up this morning, which is the 21st of April, to the news that Pope Francis had died. And so we wanted to take an opportunity to pay tribute to Pope Francis through the lens of pilgrimages, because pilgrimage journeys were an important part of his ministry. He went on 47 international pilgrimages. And of course, this Jubilee year had a theme, Pilgrims of Hope. And so both the pilgrims themselves and the pilgrimage journeys were an important focus for Pope Francis. And so we wanted to ensure that on this episode, we talk about the work and the life and the ministry of Pope Francis as it pertains to pilgrimages. And also the canonization of Carlo Acutis is now delayed, date to be determined. And so I still wanted to release this episode to give information to listeners and viewers about the canonization in preparation for whenever that will be. It was scheduled to be the 27th of April, but it is now delayed for, as I said, an undetermined period of time. So Michael and I had talked a bit during the day and thought that it would be interesting and also informative for viewers and listeners to hear about our view, a pilgrimage view on the life and then ultimately the death of Pope Francis. And so I did some research in preparation for this segment and learned a bit about Pope Francis and his focus on pilgrimages. And actually, I'm a bit remiss that I didn't recognize all of this before. But here we are. So, as I said, Pope Francis went on 47 international pilgrimages. He during a rather short period of time, 12 years as Pope, he made these 47 pilgrimages, and he was actually the first Pope to visit Iraq, and did so in 2021. His messages during his pilgrimages were always focused on peace, on inclusion, caring for the poor and marginalized, which were hallmarks of his ministry and time on this earth. And then of course this Jubilee year, which we talk about in the episode, which follows this, is also focused on hope and on young people being a hope for the future. And so, Michael, you've had some time to process this over the course of today, and I'm curious about your own thoughts. I see you've got something behind you that is a reminder of Pope Francis's pilgrimage to Philadelphia in 2015, and you had the opportunity to encounter Pope Francis in a couple of different ways over the course of the last few years. So I thought I'd turn it over to you.
Well, thanks for having me. I mean, I don't make any. I'm an anthropologist and an anthropologist of pilgrimage, but I'm also a practicing Catholic, and one that always admired, or always for the last 12 years anyway, admired Pope Francis, and it was quite a shock waking up after Easter, to his passing. Although I guess it's very fitting, right? I mean, you can't pick a better time to go than after the resurrection. So and I think him coming out, he did come out yesterday to greet the pilgrims, to greet the faithful. I think people weren't really sure if they were going to see him or not, was also really meaningful. And I think it adds a lot. And like you said, there's popes are always really interesting about pilgrimage, right? I mean, if you want to go all the way back, and something that I talk about I guess in that book that I'm pointing to, the gray one, the Seductions of Pilgrimage. I mean, pilgrimage to Rome had been always, kind of declared, especially in the Middle Ages when it wasn't really possible to go to the Middle East, to Jerusalem. And that was something that Martin Luther really kind of excoriated, that really protested against, for a lot of reasons. But I think it's also really important to do these pilgrimages to Rome. And you have people, and the Pope's kind of telling you to go to Rome, or to go on pilgrimages in general. But then you also have, like you said, popes going on pilgrimages themselves. And we've been fortunate, I guess, at our age, or at my age, that I've lived through, I guess I lived through more than three, but I was really young. But Pope John Paul II did tons and tons of pilgrimages, and he was really famous for that. And Pope Benedict, very importantly, did pilgrim, especially to Padre Pio's, to San Giovanni Rotondo, where I was doing research. We were there when the Pope came for that pilgrimage, and then Pope Francis had done a number of really, really important pilgrimages that I think that we can talk about, and they weren't always really grand international pilgrimages. I mean, like our wonderful, I'm in outside of Philadelphia, and it was 2015. He was a rock star, and he came to Philly. Even the pizzerias made boxes. It's a somber day, but it is kind of it's a really interesting for an anthropologist to have this, and it's kind of funny as well. But it just shows, right, that how localities also kind of put their own spin and their own localness onto these international events. I mean, every place is different, but certainly New York and Philly, there's lots of Italians, lots of pizzerias, and that's something that just kind of subtly came out there. So I think he's been interestingly, he's been another pope that did a lot of pilgrimages, despite the fact that he really didn't travel much internationally before he was pope, and that's kind of interesting as well. Yeah.
I was reading this morning that he addressed Italian pilgrims, which we actually talk a little bit more about in the upcoming episode that follows this. But his address to Italian pilgrims who were walking the Camino de Santiago happened at the end of last year in I think around 19 December, so mid to late last year. And one of the things that we often talk about in pilgrimage studies is what differentiates a pilgrimage from another type of travel journey, and what differentiates a pilgrim from another type of traveler. And I had not realized that the Pope had thoughts about this. And so I discovered that this morning, that the Pope actually said that there were three signs that define a pilgrimage. One of those is walking in silence. The second is rereading the scriptures while on the pilgrimage. And the third is something that he labeled the Matthew 25 protocol. And then in quoting the scripture, whatever you did for one of these least brothers of mine, you did for me. Again, a focus on the poor and marginalized and those who are less fortunate, should be a focal point of pilgrimages. And so I thought that was interesting, because we oftentimes don't talk about the silence. Some people do, but oftentimes we talk about pilgrimage as being a communal event.
Sure.
And so from the perspective of Pope Francis, though, the silence was an integral part of the pilgrimages, as was rereading the scriptures.
And I think those two things, not to cut you off, but so I think these 3 points really do kind of mesh well with like his background as well. So he is Ignatian, right? He's a Jesuit, and I went to Georgetown. I went to a Jesuit university, and I participated in Jesuit retreats, which are all in silence. And what you're supposed to do in these silent retreats is you're supposed to read the scripture, and you're supposed to project onto yourself, in silence, meditate on the scripture reading, and put yourself as a character in in the story, in the biblical story that you are doing. So I think that really is very salient. I mean, as you were saying, I'm sorry, I was like, I got to cut you off because, it is
It's
really
important because you're seeing how his tradition is then playing out in the view on pilgrimage.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's like key Ignatian spirituality. That's how you kind of discern, what you're supposed to be doing. I did a 5-day silent retreat in the mountains, the Shenandoah Mountains, right after graduation at the turn of the millennium, and that was a really important experience for me. I didn't consider it pilgrimage, it was a retreat, but at the same time, the silence. It's very hard for me to be silent, to do 5 days of silence where you have to point even to with other people. There are other people there too. You have to kind of gesture, pass the pepper, pass the salt, like, but it aside from that stuff, you really, it really is impactful. And I think also, as you're a psychologist, I'm an anthropologist, the real difference I think we'd both agree on in terms of what differentiates pilgrimage from tourism is an interior journey, is the interior change. I talk in next episode or whatever, I talk about, this idea of being a hyper meaningful journeys. It all journeys are meaningful. I think that's important, even touristic journeys. But there's something individual yet collective about the meaningfulness of any pilgrimage that I think differentiates yourself. So if you are going to, like we were talking about, I don't know, whatever you say, Cooperstown, the Baseball Hall of Fame, if it's super meaningful for you and you're ruminating on it and you're there, like, you can't help but be almost in silence, even though there's lots of other people around. And even though you're also sharing joy, I mean, he's a very joyful person. This isn't something that, we should think that being silent, being, studious of the scriptures. I mean, he's not the studious of the scripture. And that was Pope Benedict, we would think about that, but it still has a really important role in Ignatian spirituality, but also in, in pilgrimage and in Catholic spirituality in general. And then, of course, the third one is very Franciscan. Pope Francis was really a little bit interesting. It's a little odd, or very new, I should say, when he was elected. This is the first Argentinian pope. He was the first non-European pope in, like, whatever, 1300 years or something. And of course, North Africa, those other popes were from, like, the Holy Land area, this area, larger area, but certainly Latin American pope. But also the first Jesuit pope. And then what does he do? And he names himself after the founder of the Franciscan order, because he was so much of the people. And he really had Franciscan spirituality, Franciscan values of charity and mercy, and so to say, if you're going on a pilgrimage and you're not showing mercy, if you're not showing charity, right, then it's not a pilgrimage, because you're not doing what you're saying, right? So it's that the faith and acts are both important, and that's something also that was a very big Protestant Reformation kind of a thing, with faith and good works versus just faith itself. We really do believe you have to do action, backing up faith. And pilgrimage was itself, always seen in that time period in the Renaissance and the Middle Ages as backing up the faith with, like, showing that you're kind of suffering and you're spending money and you're spending time doing this oftentimes very arduous pilgrimage. But he's saying, look, it's not about that. It's also about charity, right? Like, which is very, what Martin Luther was kind of criticizing, that men were leaving in the 1500s, spending the household income, right, on God knows what, also as they're traveling down Europe into Italy, not working, right, the very Protestant work ethic. So they weren't working, they weren't earning money, they were spending money on this kind of frivolous stuff. And so I think it's really interesting what you said, Heather, because it almost converts the Catholic idea of pilgrimage as the good work, to back up your faith, with saying, no, the really good work is, if you're going to spend money, you should spend it on other people. You should be helping the poorest of everybody, or else you haven't gotten what pilgrimage is supposed to be.
And I think that communal or collective focus rather than it being on a community of pilgrims, while that's important, that even in the pilgrimage that there is a focus on the greater good of society rather than just the pilgrims themselves.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think all three of the major, I would say there are like three major kind of pilgrimage events in his papacy that were really important. The first really big one and the last one that we're in right now are the Jubilees. We have actually, even though he's only been here 12 years, and for me, I don't know, it seemed like for us, it seemed like a very short period of time. But actually, I mean, it was enough. It was a good.
That's because we're getting old.
That's probably what it is.
The
I mean, I was talking to my wife about this. What, didn't he just become Pope?
Yes, it was a decade ago. But, we think about a decade as being the 90s, right? A decade ago was the 1998.
John Paul II, passed away. But in 12 years, you have a Jubilee year once every 25 years. So it started in 1300 when the Pope in Avignon, and who's like kind of the exiled Pope in Avignon, said everybody should go to Rome. He couldn't even go, right? But he sent his vassals, there and everything else. And that was supposed to be every 100 years. And then it got shortened to 50. And then, pretty soon after, I mean, by that time of Martin Luther, certainly it was every 25 years. And, he wasn't Pope for 25 years. So, it was, who knows whether he would have been able to make it. But he also had the year after this, he had the extraordinary Jubilee Year of Mercy. And I think that is so important, right? We were just talking about this. This really kind of characterizes his idea of pilgrimage. Not only do I want you to come to Rome, and I want you to really understand what mercy is, what charity is, right? To be merciful to other people. And for me, it was a really important time because, as you know, my primary research and my dissertation research and everything else, I've been studying Saint Padre Pio of Pietrelcina for decades, and he had the stigmata for 50 years. What was interesting is that he had the stigmata. He started in 1918 when he prayed. The Pope was Benedict. There was a different Benedict. Pope Benedict at the time said everybody should pray for the end of World War I. And he prayed to be a victim soul. And he said, please take me instead. Also going on was the Spanish flu. So not only the boys at the front, dying, but the women and children were really hit hard by the Spanish flu. And so that was his prayer, Padre Pio's prayer in 1918. And he had the stigmata. He had this big, two different events. He had the transverberation first, where he saw a scary image of must be of a seraphim stabbing him with a flaming sword into his side, stabbing his heart, and that's called the transverberation. And then it just was really super painful. And a month later, he had another vision where he had the stigmata, and he had that for 50 years. He suffered. He was not, he was kind of cranky. People I've interviewed that met him, my family members who passed around. Sort of, I mean, we're from Pietrelcina as well. He was sort of cranky at times. He would cast you out of the confessional without, absolving you if he thought that, if he knew that was another of his supernatural abilities, that he knew your sins. And if you didn't, you didn't confess something, he'd cast you out. I was just giving a talk on Padre Pio and for this retirement community, and somebody from Croatia said, my sister met him back in the day in the 60s. And yeah, we didn't know she had an illegitimate child, but Padre Pio said, you have an illegitimate, he knew that somehow. Yeah. And, but anyway, so obviously you'd be a little cranky. You're suffering from the stigmata for 50 years. But he was always very merciful, and so Pope Francis this was so huge. He asked for the body of Padre Pio, as well as another Capuchin saint who's not very well known. He's in Padova. His name was Leopold Mandic, and he asked for both of their full bodies to be brought down and put in veneration in St. Peter's Basilica. And this was an extraordinary event. I took 5 students of mine as well on a pilgrimage with the National Center for Padre Pio here in Pennsylvania near Pottstown. with 40 devotees in the prayer group. And I mean, it was the first time in centuries and centuries that saints have been paraded around the streets of Rome. I mean, it was an incredible experience. And then the height of it all for me was seeing Pope Francis. He had a papal audience for all of the members of the prayer groups that came, and there were 80,000 of us in Piazza San Pietro, in the piazza in front of St. Peter's, and he came around very famously. You know, he was in the Pope Mobile, but he never wanted to wear the bubble. He didn't want to be covered, which was something that was instituted when Pope John Paul II was shot. But you know, we were really up close with him, and you know, his address and everything else, he was talking about mercy. And those two Capuchin saints were saints that, you know, were extended mercy because of their ministry in the confessional, in confession. And there are so many stories about Padre Pio and about pilgrimage, you know, not to talk too long, but you know, that was his real ministry. You know, you think about the supernatural, you know, and people coming and flocking there, millions were flocking to see his stigmata, but they were also going to confession. So much so that in post-World War II, southern Italy, where even today it's often difficult to get ourselves in order, you know, in an orderly, we can't make a line in Italy, you know, we all just converge. And southern, they instituted a very, very organized plan of using like chips, like poker chip kind of things of different colors to ensure that different types of people were able to see and confess to Padre Pio. Like there were a certain amount of chips allotted to locals, to Southern Italians, to broader Italians, to international visitors, to ensure that they can all be there. And, you know, people would say that Padre Pio was in the confessional at the height, you know, in the 40s, 50s, like 20 hours a day. He would hardly sleep. He would hardly eat. And he would just hear confessions in any language. He famously said, "Send me your guardian angel," you know, to you know, provide the translation. And he would do that. So Pope Francis wanted in instilling this idea of mercy. What better way to have pilgrimage and mercy, like really ensure that by doing a pilgrimage for mercy, and having Padre Pio, who his body never left, you know, since he got his stigmata in 1918, he had never set foot outside, dead or alive, set foot outside of San Giovanni Rotondo. This was so extraordinary that he came back. He came down up to Rome, and on his way back, I mean, as a Pietrocinese, you know, my grandfather's from Pietrocina. You know, Pietrocinese always said, why can't we have him here, you know? And he came, you know, they brought him in the motorcade back from Rome to San Giovanni Rotondo. It was in Pietrocina, and you should have seen, we were there, and I mean, you should have seen people with the banners in our dialect saying "Welcome home" and all that. It was just amazing. It was an amazing time. But it was really in line with his theology.
Yeah. So you talked about the pilgrimage of mercy and the Jubilee theme of mercy. And we get into, in this follow-on episode, we talk about the hope as a theme. We didn't really talk that much about pilgrims of hope. And I wish we would have gotten into that a little bit more. But having so yes, maybe it is inherent in a Jubilee year that's focused on hope. There's an inherent understanding that who is being addressed here is pilgrims of hope. Can you say more about that? It feels significant at this moment also. It's not like the Jubilee year is going to go away. And then under the larger banner, this Pilgrims of Hope, it seems that, I don't know, it seems spiritually significant.
Yeah, I think, you know, first of all, so, you know, these Jubilee years, we get these themes, you know, it makes it more organized, also theologically, you know, books are written on it, and he has his addresses written on it. And hope is something that I think he did see was very important, and necessary in this day and age. I mean, there's a lot of problems that have seemed to have gotten worse in 12 years since he's been there. If you think about it, we'll talk about pilgrims in a second, but if you think about it, his one of his first, I think it was his second encyclical, or first, whatever, his first encyclical and second, I'm sorry, his first two major addresses, were on on the environment and like kind of the hypercapitalism, his two encyclicals, and they seem to only have gotten worse in the past 12 years. He was very outspoken about the wars that are going on in Ukraine, and also very importantly, he went, I guess you call it, a pilgrimage to Lampedusa. He went to, where the boats of all the migrants from North Africa first land in Italy, especially during the migrant crisis of about half, his time ago,
Yeah.
about 6 years ago. So he was very much, in terms of saying we need to extend mercy towards migrants, especially, and he hoped to see Europe as a young continent, a young area filled with new migrants and things like that. So obviously, that's not really, especially in America, that's a theme that is not being taken. So I think that it was deliberate to have this idea. It was a little, I think, probably political, not in American politics, but in general, to have hope. But I think where you're getting at, and you tell me. I mean, I think pilgrimage is about hope a little bit, isn't it?
I do think it's about hope. I mean, you talked about the Pope passing away right after Easter, on Easter Monday. He's sort of set this agenda, or is the figurehead for the agenda focused on hope. There is an upcoming canonization of Carlo Acutis, perpetually young. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of alignment here in thinking about newness and hope and potential, and what can become the world that we can envision. And it seems like there's a really big opportunity to pause in this moment with the loss of the head of the Catholic Church, to think about what is the world we envision. um because you've talked about, and I think rightly so, Pope Francis was also looking at many things that are chaotic and out of order and disarray, and there's a war and famine and a migrant crisis in many places in the world, where there's disorientation happening. And it seems like this might be a moment for us collectively as humans on the planet to think about what kind of world we could envision. So I do think that this theme of hope, even though it may have been envisioned differently with Pope Francis being alive, perhaps this message is even more poignant because he has passed away.
I agree. I think built into pilgrimage in general, I think there is an inherent sense of hope, or else you wouldn't be doing it, right? You go there in the hopes of something, right? Of receiving. So many of my pilgrims that I've traveled with for Padre Pio pilgrimages, I mean, they come with hopes for healing, hopes for the future, hopes for their children, or just to get something out of it, right? Some sort of a sense of transcendence. And we have to also remember that pilgrimages in Catholic theology, especially, but in general, I mean, anthropologists, we talk about this too, is that this idea that pilgrimage is not just supposed to be about the destination, but also the journey. We often forget that, and especially looking at the shrines and looking at these places and the things and the rituals that we do at these places when we get to Rome or something. But the whole journey, right, should be part of that. And if you go all the way back to Saint Augustine, in his City of God, in the book The City of God, which is one of my favorites, he talks about us living in the city of man, the civitas terrenum, and aspiring one day we want to go to the civitas Dei, to the city of God. And all of us are on a pilgrimage, and he uses that term, on the route, all faithful people. are on what he calls the Civitas Dei Supra Terram, which is the city of God on earth, or he also calls it the Pilgrim Church on earth, right? So any Catholic, we say in Mass, the Pilgrim Church on earth. We say that every Mass at a certain point. The priest says it during the consecration. And so each time we do that Mass, each time we celebrate, each time we go to church, each time we live our lives, hopefully giving to the poor, like Francis is saying, showing mercy, we are on that path, right? That spiritual path, that pilgrimage to a better world. So you're always hoping, gosh, I hope I'm going to get to the Civitas Day. I get stuck in the brambles and the sticker bushes and whatever that are on the lining that route, right? I just hope I don't get too pulled back, and obviously that's the sin, right? And that I can continue. So I think, of course, that there's something built in, but as you mentioned, it is interesting that the death of a pope, there's a lot going on, right? There's this funeral, is very sad. I think it's as a museum person too, like it upsets me that they, part of the ritual at the end is they break his ring because he's no longer the pope. He's no longer the head of the church. I don't like to see material culture being smashed, but after that funeral, then you go into that conclave, right? And you have to elect a new pope. And I mean, I remember several of them now, and you're looking, and and the black smoke comes out, and they haven't, figured it out yet. And then finally when the white smoke comes out, and it's like, you kind of almost, something you forget about the last pope, but the hope, comes flowing in, and you're going to see tons and tons of pilgrims that are going to be in St. Peter's to watch, St. Peter's Square to watch when that smoke is white, who we've elected. And there's a huge amount of hopefulness there. So, I mean, not to overshadow his passing, and this is the time when we mourn, and of course all death. I mean, whether you're in Eastern philosophy or Western, right? All death is regenerative in some way. There is going to be hope, and I think this is it's taken on almost more this Jubilee year of hope, right? We don't want to think we're both in black and we're sad, and I don't feel very in jubilation right now, but I think when one sees that white smoke coming up again, there's going to be a lot of jubilation, and it doesn't reflect anything on Pope Francis, but it's that hope, right? It's that hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Pope Francis's pilgrimage on earth is over and on to the city of God.
Yeah. There's another pilgrimage that was extraordinary that he did, that was super hopeful, and we can't forget it because it's something that is seared into my brain. I get choked up every time. It's probably PTSD, but I get choked up every time I see it because it was COVID. It was during COVID. I show it in class when we talk about health and healing and everything in my intro to anthropology class. But that was in these two periods in March during the lockdown. Italy was really, March of 2020. Italy was really
hit very hard,
really hardly hit, and it was really difficult on the people because you needed a letter to go out to the store. You had to have a letter, and people will stop. The police would stop you. I had a good friend of mine was his childhood home. His mom has a really nice house with a pool and all this other stuff kind of up on the mountain. But he had his son and his wife, and they had a little apartment down in the main town of Pesaro. And he couldn't, because he could only go two people at a time. They were locked down. His poor kid was like 4 years old, and he had to stay in the house. So it was really, really tough. But he came out on the 16th of March, and he made a pilgrimage. He walked a certain amount of places to the two important churches that really marks the hopefulness of salvation for the Romans. So the big church, the main church that he always goes to actually is Santa Maria Maggiore. So it's the one of the four papal basilicas. It's the one that's closest to the to train station in Rome, in Termini, and the Forum, and it was built over the site where it extraordinarily snowed after, Marian apparition in the early antiquity. It snowed in July in Rome. I mean, never hardly snows period in Rome, but to have that happen. But there's this icon, the Mary health of the people, Salus Populi Romani, and it's an icon of her. It's like a Byzantine style icon in 593. Pope Saint Gregory the Great carried it out when there was a plague outbreak, one of the earlier plague outbreaks in Rome, and it supposedly cured them from the plague. And then it's been used other times. I think in the 1800s, 1837, Pope brought it out for a cholera outbreak. There are a lot of cholera. And then he went to this small church of San Marcello, and there's a crucifix, a wooden crucifix that also had is believed had saved the Romans from another plague outbreak in the Middle Ages. And so he did that pilgrimage during lockdowns when nobody was on the road and nobody was outside. He did it just a humble man doing it for the sake of everybody. Sort of that Christological, that Padre Pio kind of victim, But then the thing that it's so extraordinary if you see those photos on the 27th where he would do that annual the Urbi at Urbi address. So it's to the city and to the world address that he usually would give. You usually give it. It's kind of like the State of the Union, right? You give it from the up high to all the people. It's raining and cold and miserable and zero people in Piazza San Pietro. So I go to Italy a lot. I go to Rome a lot in my life. Even at 6 a.m., 5 a.m., to see zero people in the piazza is, something you've never seen before. And it's just him with these two icons that he had brought outside of St. Peter's and praying to God to save us all, whether or not you were Catholic, whether or not you're, save the world from this global pandemic. I mean, it's something that was, super extraordinary. Super extraordinary.
Is that the most significant memory? When you think about Pope Francis, is that the one memory that seems very salient in encapsulating who he was?
Yeah, I think so, because I think it brings everything together. I think it brings the hope, right? There was also hope in that. I mean, it's really sad, but it was all hope. I mean, it was all hopeful. We put our faith, and he talked about, if I can remember, because we didn't really prepare for this conversation, right? But like, he did talk about, faith, and again, faith is like hope, right? You have belief without seeing it for yourself. So it's necessary that you have to have hope, right? To have faith, and you have faith in God and faith that things will work out. And so therefore we did have hope that what he was doing was important. God would listen to the prayers and God would protect. And I remember watching with my family. I mean, there's nothing else to do anyway, but we wanted to watch it anyway, on the television, and that was the time when we did mass on the television. I mean, we would take out little pieces of bread. I don't know if that was sacrilegious or not. And, we did all that stuff, right?
People want to connect.
We wanted
and
to connect.
want to believe that we will get through this terrible time. So yeah, I mean, it's important. I think that you're bringing up that Pope Francis also carried a lot of responsibility for not just Catholics, because many people were turning to the Pope to see how he would respond to the pandemic, and we're seeking some type of reassurance and some type of hope that we would get through this collectively.
Yeah. I mean, I think any figure, a lot of people did lot of leaders did different things. Even the leaders, think about Italy, the memes that would go around of like the mayors screaming at their people, like, how
I
many
love
times you
the
have to walk your
singing.
dog? Do you remember those?
I also love the singing. People
And the
going
singing.
out, and people were singing back and forth because they couldn't be together, but they were singing out on balconies,
Mhm.
and that was really beautiful. I mean, when I do think about the great moments of the pandemic and the moments that connected us as humans, I do think of the Italians, because in the midst of so much tragedy, um, they the Italians were finding ways to get through it in a way that inspired other people too.
Mhm. Yeah. And I mean, right? I mean, singing is hopeful.
Yeah,
I think that's
yeah,
built into that too.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. Well, we
I
hope for the best, right?
we,
Hope we get
we hope that,
another good pope.
yeah. Thanks so much for yeah. We sort of just jumped online. This is the evening, Monday evening, and this episode with this bonus tribute to Pope Francis will be out tomorrow morning. So
Thank you.
yeah,
I mean, thank you
uh,
for having me. And again, obviously, our condolences, to his family, and and of course, the whole world, I think, is reeling right now. But I think they'll see the hope. I think already I've been hearing, more hopeful kind of talk, and
mhm,
remembering the really great things about this Pope. He was a really extraordinary person, and a great model. One of the things we talk about with Carlo and with Padre Pio is that these saints are supposed to be um, models for us to follow. And Pope Francis actually would talk about, you should look at everyday saints, the saint next door. You don't need to look for the extraordinary, right? It doesn't take a stigmata to make you a saint, you know. And I think, who knows if he'll be named a saint or anything in the future, but certainly he was trying the best he could, that anybody could, to model the right virtues. He did it really effectively. He did it really um, notably, right? He would never wear any of the fancy trappings. He didn't stay in the papal apartments and things like that. He took public transportation. That's back when he could. Um, and so I think we got to remember that, right? That's really,
yeah,
he modeled it really well. So,
yeah.
but thank you for having me.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it.
Yeah, and I guess this will just sort of flow into the other episode we recorded last week on the canonization of Carlo Acutis. Also, so that was about half of the episode. So for people who are just maybe listening to this little bit, Michael also talked about Padre Pio, and we talked about kind of pilgrimages in general, and what makes a pilgrimage and a pilgrim a pilgrim. So there are lots of other important bits within the episode. It's so nice to see you again, Michael. Thank you
No,
for
it's
being
great.
here and taking time to talk to me about some interesting, historically interesting, and almost unprecedented events that are happening over the next few weeks from a Catholic perspective about a new saint who is going to be canonized, which we'll be talking about shortly. I'd love to see the artifacts that you brought to show us, which are related to what we will be soon talking about.
Yeah. You want me to do a
Yeah,
show and tell?
yeah,
So
please.
thank you, Heather, for inviting me. It's always great to see you, and of course we collaborate sometimes as well. So it's neat to be here. As you know, I'm a museum director as well, as an anthropologist of pilgrimage and tourism. So I kind of made a little museum in my very dirty office. I made a little bit of a museum exhibit. So let me just I'll turn it around a little bit here for you.
We're on a virtual tour right now.
You're on a virtual. Can you see? So what you're looking at right now are a couple of things. So I am a researcher for over a decade on the what we would call the Catholic saints cult of Padre Pio of Pietrelcina. So Padre Pio himself was like the saint of the millennium when he was canonized in 2002. He was, if you haven't heard of him, he was born in the late 1800s. He died in 1968, but he had the stigmata from 1918 all the way to 1968. And so that was exactly 50 years. Went away a week before he died. But what was extraordinary about him, and why I've studied him, besides the fact that he's from my mom's hometown in Pietrelcina in Italy, was because this isn't some very old school, St. Francis, who was the first verified stigmatic in the 1200. This isn't like back then, where they didn't have doctors or scientists and things like that. These were like medical doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists are sticking their fingers through his holes in his hands, trying to figure out how he might have faked them. And so he was a huge living saint during his lifetime. Pilgrimage had started from when he received the stigmata, when word spread in 1918. And of course, it grew during the times of my research in 2008 and 2009, when they exhumed his body. He was already a saint at that time. Put him in a new basilica, which was ultra modern, designed by Renzo Piano to hold over 30,000 people. And then Pope Francis, when he became the Pope in 2016, he had an extraordinary Jubilee Year, Jubilee of Mercy, and he asked to have the body of Padre Pio moved and brought down and laid in on the altar of St. Peter's, St. Peter's Basilica. And I was fortunate to bring even students to see that. But one of the big things, especially for that older generation who knew Padre Pio, he was really very magnetic for these people. But he had a very interesting kind of devotional cult around him that was different than the authorized, different than the what the church was saying. So when he was canonized in 2002, he was seen as like an icon of obedience. He was, despite all the problems he had, all the suffering he had, the church kind of didn't. They were very skeptical of him for many different periods of his lifetime. Different popes didn't like him. Pope John the 23rd thought he was the devil. And he was able to withstand that. Pope Francis kind of changed that narrative and said, look, he is the quintessential ideal of mercy, of giving mercy. He was what you would call part of this early 20th century mystical movement called victim soul mysticism, where he basically prayed, for the end of World War I, for the end of the Spanish flu, and he just said, take me instead. Very Christological, very Christ-like. So that was his big narrative for the church. But for the average people, especially those who knew him and met him, and I still meet people who have met him. They're older now, of course, but also other people who come to his shrines, even the ones here in Pennsylvania. He's really a healing saint. And so what you have here, and I'll actually grab it, is, I have a first-class relic of his blood. So Padre Pio famously, he has this, he had the stigmata. He would wrap his wounds, his hand wounds, with the gauze, which you see here. And then he would cover it with these mitts, these fingerless gloves. And so this had a piece of a little bit of blood on here. So this is a big reason why people even today come to pray to his shrines. Even there's a National Center for Padre Pio about 40 minutes away from me, right down the road. People come there and they, can pray with his glove, and they talk about being healed of all kinds of ailments, from epilepsy and hemophilia to cancer. Lots of cancer survivor stories. So that's one kind of old school, but also modern, because people met him. And then I have some prayer cards for this person who's going to be a saint next week, April 27th, 2025, for Carlo Acutis. He died at 15 years old. And he is the new saint of the millennium. So Padre Pio was that first, for my generation, for the boomer generation. And now for millennials, he's going to be the first millennial saint. sainted for him and for Gen Z, who are the big audiences and who are really kind of devoted to him. There's a big movement online for him. He's their new saint. So I have some of these things that we can talk about.
I've been to a couple, well, at least one large church in Paris that has a chapel for Padre Pio. I don't know if I sent you a photo of that, but it's very vivid in my mind where the small space is inside. I did not realize that he had that his life was so recent. For some reason, I thought he died quite a long time ago, but you said he died after the First World War?
No, he died in 1968.
Oh my gosh. So
Yeah.
this he
So he,
really
yeah.
okay. Yeah, I am way off then.
Yeah, and that's why he's so, relevant, because he was known for really two things: the stigmata, but
Yeah.
also, he's known to kind of know your sins before you confess them. So people would go to the confessional also to kind of meet this guy who, has the bloody hands
Yeah.
and feet inside. And he would, notoriously like kick you out without giving you absolution if you were not telling the truth. He was able to know everything. And actually, if you want to hear the story, of how I obtained this relic,
I was going to ask about it. So
because this
you're
is a
jumping
pilgrimage
ahead.
in of
Yeah.
itself. So it's not my pilgrimage, but when I did this research on Padre Pio for my dissertation at the University of Chicago, and when I was at Chicago, we were members of this wonderful, beautiful church, and we live kind of in Boys Town, so it's also like the kind of the gay area as well. And I had little kids and my wife and everything, and it's just a really great church. And there was an usher who, when he found out, actually he saw something online and it turned out it was me, and I'd go to that church. So we became friends and we would talk. And I think he was, I unfortunately, I don't know what happened to him. I think he was very sick. I think he had cancer. I know he had cancer. And so I think he passed away, but he gave me this relic. And the story of this relic is that in the 60s, when he was a young man, a lot of people were flocking to see Padre Pio. It was the end of Padre Pio's life. Um, he was super famous among Americans after World War II, with especially Protestant and Catholic, GIs would make this trek up the mountain where Padre Pio was in San Giovanni Rotondo, to meet this mystic on the mountain. And there were stories of him saving, like the fighter pilots would saw him over San Giovanni Rotondo and they didn't bomb the town and everything. There's lots of stories from World War II about that. And he went there when he heard about him, and apparently to confess a big confession. So I'm not sure what that confession is. I could probably think of maybe what it could have been. And when he got there, Padre Pio didn't speak anything but dialect of our dialect of Italian. But yet he said his guardian angel could translate and all of that stuff. And he always would say, like, the big quote of his is, "Send me your guardian angel." And so this American young man came to him, came to San Giovanni Rotondo and chickened out and didn't go to the confessional. Um, he was afraid, and I think also just about like the language and everything else. But he told me he remembered that Padre Pio said, "Send me your guardian angel." So that night, when he was saying his prayers in bed before going to sleep in San Giovanni Rotondo, he prayed, to his guardian angel, and take my confession and my prayers to Padre Pio. So the next morning, uh, he comes out, and this is towards the end of Padre Pio's life, so he kind of like go out of the window, kind of like the Pope does, and talk to everybody, and everybody kind of congregates. All the pilgrims congregate around, and I guess the guy was with somebody who could translate a little bit, who knew Italian and English, and Padre Pio's talking in Italian, and he doesn't understand anything, and so he whispers to his friend. He says, what's Padre Pio saying? And the friend goes, "Oh, I don't know, nothing really. He just said he was up all night with some American guardian angel." And so that was keeping him awake all night. So, so then he became really super devoted to Padre Pio and somehow obtained two of these. And so he had gifted me one. And I do talks. People call me up from my parish, from my church, other churches, to pray with the relic as well. So for those of people who are devoted, certainly it's an important relic, and it's nice to have. During the pandemic, you and I worked on virtual pilgrimages. Certainly, it was a crazy time, but I had received lots of calls. I one a friend of the family in Spain, my parents' friends, and they both had very bad COVID, and the husband passed away, and the wife survived, but she was so distraught and still very sick. And she asked to FaceTime and touch we would touch this to the camera, and it's kind of the contagious magic, as Fraser would say in old school anthropology. The holiness would, believe to go through the ether and and make her better. So but there were several people who had that, who asked me to do that as well. So you got a little virtual pilgrimage in there, as well as embodied pilgrimage.
Did you come to be interested in Padre Pio, and also in the scientific study of religion through an anthropological framework?
So I was always, I mean, I am a practicing Catholic, and I always, I don't know, I love religion in general. I worked um, before going back to grad school. I was a tour operator, and I did lots of high-end educational tours in Italy, but also in Southeast Asia and Japan. And I mean, anywhere I went, I mean, just the wonderful Buddhist temples, wonderful, Muslim mosques in the Middle East when I would travel. I mean, I could feel, I felt something in all of those places. And when I went back to school, I wanted, and I study tourism and cultural heritage, especially World Heritage sites. And I worked on Southeast Asia for that. But when it came down to the dissertation, you know, part of it was that, I'd have to spend several years learning Khmer, really well to be able to really do something on Angkor. And I was married. My wife, who was born in Italy, she kind of wanted to go back to Italy. And we said, look, I have this, I always wanted to study Padre Pio. He's from my mom's hometown of Pietrelcina. It's a 3,000 person town, very small. Um, and it really came full circle. As soon as we got there, we found out she was pregnant. Our first son was born in Italy, so it was this kind of like hopeful. My mom was born there, then I was born in America, then my son, and so it was a really great kind of experience. But I remember studying abroad in 1998 when Padre Pio was beatified, and I was in my uncle's farm, and there was a procession for his beatification from Pietrelcina, and they walked all the way to the main city of Benevento. And so I remember being struck by that procession as well. And then 2002, he was canonized in the largest canonization ceremony at that time. And so I just really wanted to kind of figure this stuff out, right? Like study what was the difference also, in terms of what pilgrimage does to these towns. We see a lot, and this was the other thing that I was really into, was that we see a lot about San Giovanni Rotondo. So Padre Pio was born in this small town, and then 168 miles away, he moved in 1918 when he became a priest. He moved to this random, remote, very small town on top of a mountain called San Giovanni Rotondo, and immediately, kind of got the stigmata really quickly afterwards. And that town became huge. At the height of my research in 2009, there were 6 million pilgrims traveling there a year because they exhumed his body. It was a big kind of event. And then, Pietrelcina didn't get anybody really. And there was a lot of, tourism and pilgrimage management issues going on. Really, San Giovanni is very, the managers are very good about kind of making sure that pilgrims stay in that town. You give them full board, so they always have to go back to the hotels to eat their meals and everything. So there wasn't really a lot of opportunities to stay over in Pietrelcina. But nevertheless, Pietrelcina became something, extraordinary, a really wonderful kind of quintessential hill town. And it was not like that when I was a kid, and certainly not like that when my mother was there. So what was the issue here? Why was it changing for the better without actual monetary uh, influx? In fact, there was more expenditure really than monetary influx, because you would get about 10% of the pilgrims in Pietrelcina than you would in San Giovanni. So at the height, you were getting, you're still getting a lot of pilgrims, whatever, but they wouldn't stay and spend a lot of money except buying gelato and actually making a mess. And in fact, the way that they count the number of pilgrims was through the trash generated, the increase in trash. So there's more expenditures than anything else, but nevertheless, it really revitalized the town. And so a lot of my work, both on World Heritage as well as in this pilgrimage, is about the kind of the non-quantifiable, non-economic ways in which these places can have resilience and revitalization through valorization, through secondary investments, because of awareness raising mechanisms and things like that. So that's really how I came to Padre Pio, and of course the fact that he was living in a time when there were still people who met him, that you could talk to. When he was living in a time where doctors were doing the same kind of studies that they would do if I had the stigmata, on me, as opposed to something in the Middle Ages where you could kind of just write it off as though these people didn't understand science, these people didn't understand anything. I think there was a lot of extraordinary things there.
Are all of the people who come to these communities, just focusing right now on Padre Pio and sort of this cult around Padre Pio, are they always considered pilgrims?
Yeah, I love that. And I've written several books and articles on this. We move in and out of being pilgrims, and we move in and out of being tourists. My own definition of being a tourist is something that has to do with your perspective as well. John Urry talked about a tourist gaze that's similar to a medical gaze. We can look at a bruise or a cut or a cadaver, but doctors are trained to look in a certain way to see certain signs. Tourists also are that way. So you could be, I tell my students in my anthropology of tourism class, take a tour of campus. You walk by these buildings every day, but when you take a tour, you're focusing the gaze on something different. So even tourism, you move in and out of being a normal kind of non-tourist and a tourist. But then in pilgrimage, my definition of pilgrimage is that it's a hyper meaningful journey, right? So it has to be something that's really hyper meaningful to the person. Doesn't have to be religious, right? It doesn't have to be spiritual. There's lots and lots of pilgrimages, as you do too, to World War I battlefield sites, to Graceland, to Dolly World, for Dolly Parton, and those kinds of things. But it has to be really hyper meaningful, where you're really seeking out that change. And it is kind of interesting because it's the distinctions are very blurry. Pilgrimages and pilgrims utilize the same infrastructure as tourists. The same bus companies, the same hotels, the same restaurants. They're buying souvenirs, although they mean different things to them. So it's really hard to move in and out. And I don't know if I've ever told you this story, one of my favorite stories to tell. So my second year I did 2 years of research in Pietrelcina in Italy. And the second year I took around a lot of Irish pilgrims, and Padre Pio is the most prayed to saint in Italy, Ireland, and the Philippines. So Irish pilgrims are the most wonderful people. I am not Irish or Irish American, so it was really eye opening. They're just very different than Italian and Italian American pilgrims, and they were great, wonderful. I loved them so much, and but they had a problem, especially with Italian food. They really want, and I know this sounds very stereotypical, but I assure you it's true. They really want to eat potatoes every meal. That's what I was told when I was the tour guide for them. We had to think of different ways of making potatoes. They didn't want the pasta. They wanted soup and a meat and potatoes and all of that stuff. They also really did not like Italian tea, because in Italy, we serve our coffee and our tea especially the tea, kind of lukewarm, but with steamed milk, like cappuccino kind of, steamed milk, especially in the morning. Steamed milk is like what you drink. In Ireland, they want cold milk with very hot water. And so, whatever, they were told that this is the thing. So everybody came with their own Irish tea bags that they could, use because they didn't want the Italian tea. And I remember we picked up a group with a priest and everything else at the airport, and we drove. We were driving to San Giovanni Rotondo. We stopped at an Alto Grill, which is, it's the best food you'll ever get at any rest stop. And everybody wanted to get, I said, let's get some coffee or whatever. And they all ordered tea, and they were all getting irritated because the tea wasn't right, and they're complaining and everything else. And the priest just said, hey, remember, this is pilgrimage, not tourism, which is something that a lot of priests and a lot of guides will say. And this one woman goes, I know, but I just didn't think it started yet. We're still in a tourism mentality and not in a pilgrimage mentality. So, the lines are blurred. You move in and out of it, just as you move in and out of being a tourist. So you got these nested kinds of movements. So it's hard to make those distinctions. And I think that's why for anthropologists and other social scientists, it's really important that we listen to the people themselves and what they say they're doing. And I think a lot of people would not say that they're tourists when they're on pilgrimages, that they are pilgrims. Just like a lot of my study abroad students who live in a town for 5 weeks, they are very careful to distinguish themselves. They're not tourists, they're like whatever you want to say, like temporary locals. So we always move in and out of those states.
Inherent, I think, in the story about the Irish pilgrims is this idea that suffering or discomfort may be a distinguishing variable between tourists and pilgrims. That suffering may be okay if one is in a pilgrim status, but is not okay if one is a tourist. That food needs to be correct, or drink needs to be correct, or the accommodations need to be comfortable, but there's an allowance for some type of discomfort or sacrifice when one is a pilgrim.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the general idea of pilgrimage, at least academically or historically, is that suffering is built in some way. You're supposed to, especially if you want this transformation, you want to work at it, and I think that that's fine. I mean, a lot of pilgrimages, especially religious pilgrimages, certainly there is that kind of, I need to do interior work to have an interior pilgrimage, very St. Augustine, but I don't know. I mean, I don't think people going to Elvis's, Graceland are looking to suffer while they travel there, but it's still hyper meaningful, and they might still say this is like a pilgrimage to me, So I think more than the suffering is this idea of really having this be of transformative, or wanting this to be a very transformative, hyper meaningful journey. I will say that even in being a tour operator, it was always very interesting how people would have such a high threshold for sort of the suffering, where I ran them pretty ragged a lot of times. This is an educational tours that we did, and they were paying a lot of money for it. So we wanted to cram in all kinds of things. And they were good sport. I mean, they were all like pretty old, very elderly people in many cases. But they were great troopers. But you get to the hotel, and I mean, they're like totally different people, and they kind of flip out on very minor things, and God forbid you lose your luggage. And I always tell people never to bring, pack things that you should only pack things that you can afford to lose, and nevertheless they get really upset about that, like to an extent that maybe is a little bit irrational to some people. And I had a kind of, I realized doing this for so many years that really, that's their little oasis. They're creating their own little home away from home in the hotel. So if the room isn't right, or if they don't have, I mean, Americans like washcloths, like tiny little, if Italians don't have that, and like they'll like do crazy things, like they would cut bigger towels to make little washcloths. Like, why? What can't you use a bigger towel? like those like really irrational things, because that is their little like, okay, I've suffered, now I need to like have my decompression area, my own familiarity, even if I'm in an unfamiliar place. um it's like a human thing, I guess, a human trait.
But yeah, that's an interesting commentary on Americans. Why do we like little washcloths? What?
I remember reading an article when I was in college in Italian, published in one of the Italian newspapers, about how bad Italian tourists are. That, and it's really true. Like, Italian tourists will be doing some tour and they're all like smoking and talking about what they're going to have for dinner. And, if there's no pasta, just like the Irish, right? They're, the forget about it, So we're all like that. I don't think there's necessarily Americans are any exceptional in the bad way. In terms of tourists.
We just have unique categories of
We do.
exceptionalism. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about the element of hyper meaningful travel, or there being a hyper meaningful element or motivation for the travel, and talked a little bit about sacrifice or discomfort. In the example that you talked about in terms of Graceland, and this being a pilgrimage site, I think there is an element of devotion that's involved, where people are visiting the site because of some type of devotional aspect to the person or the lore or the legend of Elvis Presley. And can you say any more about that? This devotional piece?
So I think there's a couple of different ideas of pilgrimage about meaning and meaningfulness. Certainly, there's devotion, which would be something like their life history and the life history of that person, saint, whatever you want to call them. I mean, Elvis is a secular saint to some people of that generation, they intersect. And in certain cases, certainly with Catholic saints, I mean, devotional practices of actually saying to the saint, almost in this elaborate quid pro quo kind of prayer. A lot of people say, if you just help me, I'll be so devoted to you. I'll pledge my, my devotion to you. I'll help get you sainted, or whatever. That, that's an aspect, certainly. There's also, though, again, an aspect of there's always like a personal aspect, okay, to pilgrimage. And it could be a person within a collective, but there's always a personal aspect. And you could think about Elvis Presley. They're going there because they had probably some really super meaningful memories of listening to his music, or meeting him, or seeing him on stage, and just really like their life history and his life history came together. And it is about them. It is about the pilgrim. It isn't about the saint, or the person. You could also think about, going to a Star Trek convention. People have written on his pilgrimage, Cooperstown, the Baseball Hall of Fame, being a pilgrimage. Your work in World War One, battle sites as being a pilgrimage. There's no one person they're devoted to, but yet there's some meaningful connection with the site, or the people that were involved in that. That they just have this need to go there and to really kind of see it for themselves, be in the presence of this hyper meaningful place. And of course, this goes on with Eliade, who is this Mircea Eliade, this great mythographer who wrote The Sacred and the Profane. And he said that the sacred is the place where kind of this cosmological perfection erupts into the everyday life. So our life is full of chaos, and at these places, which are like landforms, or tombs, or something like that, including the hearth of a home, it's where the sacred kind of bursts out, you know, and gives this clarity, gives this order to the chaos of everyday life. And of course, you move in and out of that as well. And we always seek that clarity. We always seek that order amid such chaos in our own lives. And if it's by going to Cooperstown and just seeing baseball and remembering that, your little league, and remembering some great games that you saw with your parent, with your dad, with this and that. I mean, that. I mean, in a very secular way, totally sacred, totally transformative, at least temporarily. And I think that that's really more of what pilgrimage is than any sort of ritualistic devotion. Although, of course, that's built in. It's built in, but also it's often encouraged and built in by the site managers, especially if you're looking at a religion, right? There's certain things that you're supposed to be doing when you're there.
Thinking a lot about this, I actually remember getting into this really kind of zen place, state of flow on a
Good
train
for
from,
you. I wish I
yeah.
could get in that state.
Well, it was temporary and it was on a train going, it was a 2-hour train
Right.
voyage from Paris to northern France to this particular battlefield. And as I'm watching the landscape pass, I'm thinking about what exactly is pilgrimage, sort of generally. What is connecting all of these places and these quests? And I was thinking about your work on this concept of hyper meaningful travel or hyper meaningful journeys, amongst other thoughts around pilgrimages. And it really at this point, in this train voyage, I considered the idea that it's really our deepest humanity. It's the elements, the kind of the soul elements that make us human, projected onto a landscape. It's the memories that you were just mentioning, maybe a memory with a father, or an encounter, someone um, may have had a prayer answered, or they have read about something significant, and they go to a place, and what they're bringing is the elements of their humanity that are quite vulnerable and hidden most of the time, and they're projected onto these sites. And it seems like that's where this openness comes from. There's an openness to be transformed, because it's an act of vulnerability to have some type of quest that propels us, and we think, we hope, at a particular landscape or building or religious structure or site or sacred natural site, that there's a potential for something to happen at that site. And that is a deeply human need, that is being engaged at the site. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a little while, about the the concept of hope and what that is. That's ultimately what's happening during these pilgrimages. It is, people are bringing their hopes and dreams and aspirations and failures and disappointments, all sort of converging together in a particular landscape or structure.
Yeah, I agree. And I would add, in addition to just hope for themselves, and their vulnerability for themselves, they often are carrying um prayers for others and
Yeah.
prayers of others. So many people, so many of the Irish and Italian pilgrims that I studied and then took around as a tour guide during the research. I mean, they would have stacks of, they would buy these things. So they would call these relics. So all they are, if you could see,
Yeah.
this is Padre. This would be Padre Pio's, the same material that he was a Capuchin friar. So he was it's a reform version of Franciscanism. They would wear brown robes with a long hood. That's a capuccio. That's why they're called Capuchin, because they had longer hoods than the Franciscans do. And this is not a relic. Um, this is not like Padre Pio touched it. However, what the shrine does is they put this big fabric over his tomb and pray on it, and then you get this like third class relic, because it's, he's touching his tomb and the tomb is touching this, so you get the mediation. However, what they do is they'll go and they'll get the glove, the mitt, or this, right, which would be a first class relic, and they would touch it, and they buy like 50 of these things or 10 of these things and touch it, and then they would distribute it to all the people back at home who couldn't make the pilgrimage. And so Hilliard Kale writes about this, used to write about this a lot, really awesome stuff that, you could look at the souvenirs, another touristy thing, but they have different meanings for when they're in pilgrimage. The souvenirs are often, showing that they are thinking about this person and possibly even praying for them while they're on the pilgrimage. And so it's really a super important thing to do, to buy souvenirs, to go through what we would call in Catholicism the rite of inventio. Inventio is creating sacred objects through, through a prayer that a priest does. And so the people would buy not just this, which has this very clear kind of connection with a real relic, but things like this, which it's just a mass produced souvenir. But the priest will bless them before, at the end of the trip, and they will, now the Irish especially will call them relics, and they'll think that it's more important, and they'll give them to everybody. And they get very nervous too, with a priest. You'll do it on the bus on the way to the airport, and people will get all nervous. But it's in my bag down below in the bus, and the priest's like, whatever, yeah, it's fine. Like it doesn't matter. It's like all over. You don't have to have holding it up, for me to, but that kind of thing, right? That it's important for them, and it's not for them; it's for somebody else that they're taking their prayers to. And I think that that's important too. So, but to your point, it is very future oriented, and I like that we have this idea of hope in pilgrimages, and that's a very old tradition. This year, 2025, is Jubilee Year for the Catholic Church. It happens every 25 years. The first one was in the 1300s, and although they never called it a jubilee, it was to mark that century, and then it was 1350, and then it kind of got shorter and shorter to every 25 years. But in the papal bulls that are written, it's about going to Rome on a pilgrimage. 1350, I believe, the Pope who pronounced this, they were in Avignon in France. They weren't even in Rome. But they were exhorting people to go to Rome. That was kind of like taking it over. But they specifically said, this is a journey of hope and faith. And so pilgrimage, yeah, I think you're right. There is something about making this pilgrimage for the future, whether it's your future, whether it's somebody else's future. Pilgrims always are walking in the footsteps of others. So it's about the past, but it's also about where you're going to go in the future. And I should say, in theology, right? St. Augustine, he, in The City of God, his book, which I love, he talks about us being on we're in the city of man, the civitas terrenum, and we need to go to the city of God, the civitas Dei, which is heaven. And all of us are on this pilgrimage, the civitas Dei sopra terram, the city of God on earth, which of course is the church. And in our Catholic Mass, the priest always says that while he's doing the consecration, there's a line where he calls us the pilgrim church on earth. And so there is, of course, we are in the midst of travel while we're on earth to the end point, which is the sacred. And it doesn't matter where you are physically in the world, but it is this future oriented. We're traveling somewhere. We are transforming. We are in the midst of this transformation, this travel, and therefore we have hope.
Can you explain what a Jubilee year is, from as we are in the midst of a Jubilee year now? What does that mean? How did it originate? You gave a little bit of a summary here, but I'd like to hear a little bit more detail to orient our listeners and viewers to what the context is for this Jubilee year that's happening right now.
Sure. So I'm not a historian or a theologian necessarily. I'm not at all. I should say necessarily, but certainly there is. In ancient Judaism, there was this idea that you had to go to the temple every 50 years or something. So it was the same kind of a refreshing the order, where to seek explicit forgiveness of sins. That's why it's kind of interesting that nowadays Judaism doesn't really talk about pilgrimage as much, right? There is, but it's not like one of these emphasized things. But prior to the diaspora, the Roman era, there was this kind of need that every 50 years you're supposed to go, or every once a lifetime you're supposed to go on a pilgrimage, and that was supposed to renew the order. And so that was the way that kind of evolved in the Catholic medieval church, where in the 1300s, like I said, the Pope had celebrated this new century, and said everybody should make this trip to Rome, and kind of for forgiveness of sins, for an extraordinary event, an extraordinary movement. Remember, 1300s, you're not going to fly there. I mean, this is a tall order. So those who have made that sacrifice, that suffering, and of course that's suffering economically, because you're not tilling the fields or selling things in the emergent middle class. It's a very hard journey. You have to spend money, all that kind of stuff. If you do that sacrifice, then you will be rewarded for it. Medieval church is great about talking about that quid pro quo. But even in the Protestant era, it still became important. And then, it is this journey. It's a hopeful journey. It's supposed to mark a periodic kind of life of the church every 50 years, now every 25 years. So, for the last many, many centuries, it's been every 25 years. And those are ordinary Jubilee years. And that's what we're in right now. So the last ordinary Jubilee, Pope John Paul II, it was a huge event because it was the millennium, so 2,000 years. So that was a huge event. But then there were these extraordinary Jubilees. Pope John Paul II also did a Jubilee in the 80s, 1983, I want to say, which would celebrate the 1950th anniversary of Jesus's death, how they calculated it. I believe that was a date. I mean, I was a young kid back then. But Pope Francis, as I mentioned before, Pope Francis did an extraordinary Jubilee Year of Mercy, where he asked for Padre Pio to be the icon of that. And, I went with 5 students to do research, and we traveled with a group from the National Center for Padre Pio in Bartow, Pennsylvania, to Rome and San Giovanni Rotondo and Pietrelcina. We were among 80,000 people in a papal audience of all the prayer groups of Padre Pio around the world. So Padre Pio has all these different devotional cells or prayer groups. We were with people from Singapore, actually, which was pretty cool. So you have those extraordinary ones as well. So we're in an ordinary one, and each one has a theme, and the theme for this one is actually hope. I think it's it's a good one to have. Right now there are a lot of wars going on. There's a lot of geopolitical issues. There's a lot of movements that aren't necessarily in line with, especially this Pope's political or social views. And I think it's important. I think he's, to have that message of hope for the future, that there is hope for the church, hope for the world, amid so many different crises that are going on. So I think it's really relevant, and the Pope is a pretty smart guy about thinking of these themes that are very salient to, but also that touches on lots of different a diversity of Catholics, because not all think like he does or subscribe to his social teachings. But we can all get behind hope.
Yeah, who can't do? I mean, I guess Eeyore maybe.
Eeyore, right.
Eeyore is not getting behind hope, unless it's just like hope for more clouds.
Yeah.
So one of the events or processes that is happening this year that is coinciding with this Jubilee year focused on hope is the canonization process. Is that the right way? Is process the right word?
Or canonization.
The canonization of Carlo Acutis. Did I say his last name right?
Yeah, I think he would say
Acutis.
Carlo Acutis, but yeah, I say
Well,
Carlo
that's
Acutis
why.
in
Okay,
English.
so that's why I need to have an Italian here to properly pronounce this Italian name. And this will be the first millennial saint, and the first. Is it virtual reality saint or saint of the internet?
Saint of the internet. I
Saint
think
of the
patron saint of the
internet.
internet. I mean,
Patron
that is
saint of the
something
internet.
that's been that's circulating in the media. I don't know if they've announced like, hey, this person is going to be patron saint of the internet, but
Okay,
certainly,
so it's sort of a moniker that is being utilized by the media.
Mhm.
And okay, so
It's
who
not as
is
cool
this?
as God's influencer, which is also
Well,
what the
God's
media likes.
influencer is pretty cool. I mean, there's probably a lot of social media influencers who wish that they could have that on their tagline.
Right. Yeah.
So,
I'd like
but
to be
they are
God's.
they have they haven't done something worthy enough yet, like this young saint has. So, or upcoming saint, pending saint. So, who is Carlo, and why is this happening this year?
Sure. So this is Carlo Acutis. He like you said, he's a millennial. He was born in 1991. Actually in England, in London. His parents, interestingly enough, and I think this is important for his story. His parents they're still alive. Kind of businessmen. I think his mom worked in publishing. The dad was a banker. They were very wealthy. They moved around the world, and he just so happened he was born in London, but they're, I think, from Milan, and moved back pretty soon after he was born. He also has a maternal great grandmother, great great grandparent from America. So, I mean, they're a global family. They describe themselves as not religious at all when he was growing up. But he was always raised by nannies, and they were Polish and Irish, so very Catholic nannies. And even as a young child, the story goes he's very much a very holy kid. He loved going to mass. He loved the Eucharist. That was a big thing for him. When he was, there's a story of him being, bullied or something when he was really young, and the nanny was saying, you need to fight, to stick up for yourself, and he said, God, Jesus wouldn't like that. So he was this story. I mean, we have those stories of Padre Pio as well, right? Like as he was. For Padre Pio, I had a lot of people in Pietrelcina say he was nato santo. He was born holy. He was born a saint, and the same kind of story, same kind of narrative for Carlo. Um, he was a normal kid, and I think that that's really the most important part of this narrative. If you can see, he's always pictured in. Well, here's another one. He's always pictured wearing like a backpack, and he's buried in jeans and Nikes, sneakers, and everything else. He's a 15-year-old, and he's perpetually going to be 15. Um, he liked Pokemon Go. He liked to play on his PlayStation. He liked playing Halo, which was not a very holy game, like a shooting up kind of game. Um, he liked soccer. He had the same kind of issues apparently that other kids did. He loved Nutella and was concerned about his weight and things like that. These are all these stories that that we have. And he taught himself C++ and other programming languages to kind of taught himself how to program computer programs. And he did some work for his parish for their website. And remember, this is like in the early 2000s now, in the early couple years after the 2000s. And then he started cataloging. He made a virtual exhibition on Eucharistic miracles. So Eucharistic miracles are these miracles in the Catholic Church, especially in the Middle Ages, where Catholics, unlike even Anglicans or other Protestants, believe that when the priest consecrates the host at Mass, it actually turns into the true body of Christ and the blood of Christ, or the wine. It's not a symbol, or it's not consubstantiated with them, so all that kind of stuff. It is real. And so there are pilgrimage sites in Italy and elsewhere in Europe, like Lanciano in Italy, which is a great site, where they actually have even DNA evidence that this medieval host is really, human flesh, and we can prove it in all these different ways. So he documented, he did the first database, and then he had pictures of each of those pilgrimage sites, where possible, with all these different Eucharistic miracles were. So it was a really early virtual exhibition. And you and I have both done virtual exhibitions for museums as well as for pilgrimage sites. It wasn't as sophisticated as maybe we do, but certainly they were there. It was there. It was an online registry. And then around 2005, 2006, he did one on Marian apparitions, which are apparitions of the Virgin Mary. The last century, there was a ton of Marian apparitions, and some are still going on today, like Medjugorje. There was, obviously Lourdes in France, and Fatima in Portugal are the big ones. Knock in Ireland, and even in Egypt, everywhere. So even in Vietnam, I mean, there's Marian apparitions, and so he did that as well, and that was launched right before he passed away. So in 2006, he was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia. He had like a sore throat, and went to the doctor, and they took a blood test, and they said you have like, I mean, he died 12 days later. I mean, it was very quick, very sudden, and so he was 15 years old, and because of all of this, and because he drew so many people, his funeral, tons of people that they didn't even know came to see him, because he was already sort of made it known to himself, to others, that he was kind of a very holy kid, a very holy person. But he also had this like web presence, this early web presence in the early 2000s. And his devotion grew. Um, one of the things that canonization you need two miracles, and that has been revised. It used to be more, but now you only need two. The first miracle, you can consider yourself beatified, and you could be called blessed. So right now he hasn't been canonized yet. So it's a couple days, it's about a week before he's being canonized. He's still considered blessed Carlo Acutis. And then once you get that second miracle, which has been verified earlier this year, he'll be a saint, and be called Saint Carlo Acutis. And even those two miracles are stories of kids being touched and saved by Carlo. So the first one was a Brazilian child named Mateus, who was born with pancreatic or digestive tract disorder, and his mom heard about this holy person who had passed away, and prayed to him. And when she was praying to him, the child, who was very young, said, I want to pray that I don't throw up so much, because the kid couldn't hold down any food. He was terminal, and almost immediately he was fine. He was cured of this ailment. So that was the one that was verified. He was beatified. The beatification ceremony was supposed to take place, but then COVID hit and lockdowns hit, so it was moved a little bit to 2001. But that COVID era was actually really a sort of a boon for his canonization, because he's really appealing to Gen Z and millennials who are on the computer all the time. We were all on social media and the computer all the time, and so this just became viral. Even my students who aren't Catholic have seen memes and TikToks and things on him. So that really burst, especially saying, look, he's blessed, and he's going to be a saint, and he's going to be the saint of the internet for all the things he did. It really burst. And then and I believe it was 2023, a student, maybe studying abroad or something, or studying abroad in Florence, had a bad bicycle accident, and she had a brain hemorrhage, and her mom came to see her. And then, since they were in Florence, it's not too far away from where Carlo is buried, in Assisi, and she prayed at his tomb in Assisi. And when she got back, the girl who they thought was terminal, in a coma, came out of it and was alive. And so the Pope Francis verified that miracle with the doctors, and he's now going to become a saint. He cleared the way for that.
So does the person have to have died before the canonization process starts, or can the miracles happen while the person is still alive?
So that's a good question. I believe that the verified miracles have to happen after they've died. However, I mean, especially Padre Pio was considered a living saint in his lifetime, and I have lots of stories of miraculous encounters and healings and things like that while they met him and while he was still alive. Um, I mean, I'm not actually sure about that, but certainly the ones that have been verified miracles have all, for Padre Pio and for Carlo, has been after he has passed away, after they've passed away, to show, I guess, that they're still operating and they're still present and listening to us. Um, People make a big deal of the miracles, but really, saints are, in the catechism of the Catholic Church, our Bible. We read the Bible, but we also have this big book of tradition, where we kind of lay out the rules. um you know it says that saints are models. They're supposed to be models of kind of Christological virtue, of Christ-like virtues for us to follow. And so when we are talking about saints and praying through saints and recognizing new saints, we're recognizing that these people have lived extraordinary lives in devotion to God or to Jesus or to the church, and that we should try to be a little more like them. And of course, the extraordinary aspects of sainthood, like Padre Pio's, miraculous 50-year stigmata, showing that he is like Christ, having the wounds of the crucifixion. That's really impactful. Um, it's really big. But how many people are going to have the stigmata? You know, um, but what did he did with it? Right? That he lived through the suffering. He gave mercy to others. That's really the narrative, more so than the supernatural aspects. And in fact, in his canonization for Padre Pio, they don't talk about stigmata in the canonization thing. They talk about him living a lot of suffering, social suffering as well as psychological and physical, and leave it at that. For Carlo, it's really about being a millennial. It's really about, he's perpetually 15. Like I've said, he is buried in a see-through casket in a small church in Assisi, which is, of course, one of the largest pilgrimage sites in Italy. He asked to be buried in Assisi. He was very attracted to St. Francis. And he was exhumed from his original resting place when the movement sort of got wind, and was moved there. And it's a small church that he's in, which is entirely too small, probably. It's called the Church of the Spoliation. So it is a small church built over the site where St. Francis famously takes off all his clothes and gives them to his father, when his father says, if you don't stop being, this kind of a person, this holy person that, is giving away everything, all of our riches, you're no longer a member of the family. And so he said, all right, here, take all my clothes, take everything. I renounce, my lineage and everything else. And that was really the part where they start to see him as a saint. So it's that little church is pretty empty inside. And so now off to the side is Carlo's sarcophagus. It's a crystal. It's a see-through sarcophagus. He's buried in a sweatshirt and jeans and Nike Airs, Nikes, and there's lines out the door, and you snake all the way around so that you can see him. And of course, I got some of these Santini, these prayer cards. This is in English and this is in Italian. They're a little different, and then I touched them all to his tomb, just like people would do for this. So technically they're whatever you want to call them, third, fourth class relics, even though there's no such official designation of that.
Many pilgrims are just, even in the last year, do you have a sense of how many pilgrims are making this journey to
Yeah,
his?
I don't. I mean, I have to say it's very hard to measure, and I haven't seen numbers from the particular church. When we were going in, I don't remember there being like a ticker, a counter. When we talk about pilgrims and tourist numbers, it's usually they do hotel nights, or some other, like I said, in Pietrelcina they measure the volume of trash, and then they kind of divide it by how much an average person, what they're spending and how much what they're doing there. What complicates things in Assisi, as opposed to like San Giovanni Rotondo or Pietrelcina, is that people are coming for St. Francis. People are coming for Giotto's, frescoes, the life of St. Francis, which is known as like the birth of the Renaissance painting. The Basilica of St. Francis is a World Heritage Site. It's also the most state of the art. It has technology from the space station in there to make sure that it prevents any further damage from earthquakes in the area, because it's an earthquake prone region. So, it's hard to differentiate. Are they going for St. Francis and then seeing Carlo? Are they really just going straight for Carlo and not for St. Francis? Are they going to see the World Heritage Site, to see Giotto, right? And then, most people probably going to Assisi, they're probably seeing Giotto's paintings maybe even first. They're not all Catholic pilgrims. So it is really hard to say. However, I have seen changes. So 2022 was the first year I came back after 2 years of lockdown, and his picture was all over everywhere. I'd really never even seen him before. I've seen pictures of him in other, but like it's everywhere. And all the, there was souvenirs for him next to St. Francis souvenirs in all the shops. And my students were like, who's this kid? Who's this guy? There's a picture of him all the time. And I didn't even know where he was. And so we were like, well, let's go and, search around for him. And we had to ask around and go to different churches to look at where he would be. And then, in 2 years span last year, I mean, there was, like I said, there were people out the door. The people right in front of us were a Sri Lankan family. They were a big Sri Lankan family of like 10 people, and they had of all generations, and they had flowers that they were leaving there. We also there were children in wheelchairs coming in. They could cut the line and kind of go right in. So there was it wasn't a selfie wall, but there was like literally there was like a cardboard cutout of Carlo, and you could like stand next to it and take pictures with him. And he was in Adidas sneakers in that one, not Nikes that he's buried in, and that kind of stuff, right? But the point was that certainly it's grown, it's matured. There's also now a full chapel in the church, the Basilica of San Rufino. So San Rufino was the cathedral of Assisi at the time of St. Francis. He's the patron saint of Assisi, not St. Francis. And in that church, now right by the altar to the left, if you're looking at the altar, is Carlo's heart in a modern reliquary in this beautiful modernized chapel with big banner that says, "The Eucharist is my highway to heaven." Highway to heaven. So like that was apparently a quote that he had said. And again, it's very modern. Highway, the car, take the Eucharist, it's my highway to heaven. So so you got that. It's difficult to tease out who's going for what. But certainly Assisi is probably the second largest pilgrimage site in Italy. It's a very important site. St. Francis himself is the patron saint of Italy. And, so there's a lot going on in that town.
So you've mentioned some people bring flowers. What are other practices that are happening at the site or on the sarcophagus?
So you're so you're not really even supposed to touch the sarcophagus. You're kind of walking around, and because there were so many people, I'm talking about the last time, and again, this is anecdotal more than anything else. It was really hard to stop. They do have seats that you can sit and pray, but just like Padre Pio is the same way. He's in a see-through sarcophagus. He moves from church to church. Padre Pio moves from church to church. Once a year, they move him from his old church to his new church and back and forth. But you're really, when the lines are long, you can't really linger. And right now, Carlo's is pretty long. But certainly, especially Italians and others, they really want to touch, really want to touch that, the sarcophagus if they can. This is a very old school, very Catholic, Mediterranean Catholic idea that, what I mentioned before, that Fraser, this old school anthropologist, armchair anthropologist, really talked about contagious magic, that magic or sacredness of on a thing, right? Humans have this idea that it sloughs off, that you can rub off, and you can, just like a contagion, just like COVID, right? If you touch it, it'll, you get it now. And so that is still a very big practice in Mediterranean Catholicism, to touch, or to take things and touch it to the body, or the relic. And that's the big practice. I didn't see a lot of flowers. I did see with that family, they left the flowers on the altar. But right now I think they're just in a crowd control management situation at that church, because it is a very small church, and right now the crowds are very large. And I think it's more about moving people through, uh, than anything else, but certainly to pray. And there were a lot of young people there, and also at the chapel of San Rufino, and that was also nice. The chapel is really great to pray in, and I had even my own students. I don't even think they were all Catholic that were praying, but they wanted to stay in San Rufino because it's kind of like more prayerful atmosphere, and sit there. And so I think it's similar to Padre Pio, or to others, St. Francis even. I mean, the same thing with St. Francis. You don't see his body. He's under this very thick concrete, but you walk around it, and people put little notes in the grate that blocks you from really touching the stone that surrounds his tomb. Um, with St. Francis, you kind of rent, I guess is the best word for it. You give a donation to get an unlit candle to donate to him. So when you walk into his tomb, you get this candle, you give €1 or whatever, you get the candle, and then you just put it back in front of his tomb in a basket, and then you walk away. You don't light it. They just then take the candles back, and you do it all over again. It's kind of odd, to be honest, but obviously there's so many people going, that you can't, it'd be a hazard to be lighting all these candles all the time. So that practice is unique to St. Francis.
It will be interesting given the fact that this Carlo is is being known as the patron saint of the internet, and was so involved with virtual projects before his death, how this type of kind of virtual reality may emerge around his tomb. Whether I mean, I'm thinking about holograms and people being able to engage directly, asking questions, and communicating with him, if that is something that will be on the horizon, or other types of ways to literally virtually engage with him as a kind of pseudo living being right in this space.
So there's always been, and especially during COVID, there have been these new ways of, let's say, virtually, tapping into the saint. Um, I mean, we have to understand too, Catholicism, we're a little, all over the place, because the urge is, and the understanding, the popular understanding is often that you're praying to the saint. You're not praying to him. You're praying through a saint, is theological, right? The saint isn't doing anything. If you're touching this, technically, theologically, not, it's not, it's the faith in God, and Padre Pio may be amplifying your prayer and saying, look how devoted he is by really, touching his the part that's sick to this, and God heals you. So there's always, I mean, literally saints are virtual reality in that case. And you when you're praying and everything else, it's sort of like this. You don't have to be there to have him or her amplify your prayers to God. During COVID, and even before, certainly the easiest way of people doing this was certainly on like YouTube videos. When people were creating these things, or even these lectures, I did this lecture during lockdown on Padre Pio for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, and it immediately had 60,000 views, which is a ton for academics, not for other, but for us, it'd be great if this one gets 60,000 views. But people have been, and they continue to write prayers or debating things I say, on the comments. And I think that that's like the earliest um, devotional practices. Like they're using that video as a, and the comment section to as a means of like extending the experience, right? Extended reality, um, kinds of stuff. And then during COVID, of course, we different churches started live streaming, and certainly that was something that they were considering, and they've done even in Assisi, to meet the needs of people who are locked down. Um, and now, of course, I think there is this potential to do more of the things that you've done and we've done in our museums and everything else, which is to create these 3D virtual sort of Google Maps kind of ways of navigating through an area and seeing the saint. I mean, it's the most immersive that you can get with a 2D screen, um, and it works really well. I recently had one of my secular virtual exhibitions for our museum win a runner-up prize in using the technology that it did, and the virtual site that you have is 10 times better. Actually, it's really great. And so I think that this is a movement that first of all captures social, on social media and mediated through the internet much more than um, other movements have been. So I think there's great potential there. That being said, uh, we are still, the people making the ultimate decisions and the people who are still kind of sustaining the church are, of course, of an older generation, that maybe don't aren't as knowledgeable about how to use the internet, right? Like I'm thinking of even my parents and stuff. And for that, what I think is really funny is that the first time I ever came into contact with Carlo Acutis or his virtual exhibitions was actually in a very old school, two-dimensional physical exhibition that the cardinal who's running it literally printed out his web pages, his static web pages, on big easels like a poster session, and they were in my church. This was before COVID. The Eucharistic miracles, and then all of the and it's beautiful, and the Marian apparitions, and it's beautiful and everything, but it's like super 2D, super physical, non. No, they didn't really mention it, or highlight, I should say. They mentioned it, but they didn't really highlight that this was actually an online thing that was made by this kid that was going to become hopefully a saint. So you do have that pressure, right, to make sure that he's appealing and accessible to lots of different audiences. So you do have millennials, you do have I'm the end of Gen X, but Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, my kids, right, that use the internet a lot. He is on memes and TikToks and YouTube videos of his mom has some YouTube films and things. But then you also have the older school stuff for the older generation. And I think that that's really important in terms of getting people. But that being said, this is about hope. It's no accident that he is being, um, let's say, canonized or elevated to sainthood, canonized during the Jubilee weekend of teenagers. So the Pope Francis is having that weekend, in late April, to be like kind of World Youth Day, because this teenager Jubilee celebration, and he's being canonized there on the 27th of April. And he is dressed uh, as a 15-year-old. He is his stories really emphasize that he's a kid just like you, uh, and remembering that saints are saints for other people, as Pierre Deleuze said long ago, that they really, we see, they're here for us. They're not here for themselves. They're good. They're fine. Um, they're here to help us, and we make them saints. We consider them saints. It's a institutional thing. We could miss some people who are really holy that are with God, and that's okay. But these people, there's something about their story, their narrative, that makes them really salient models for us to model ourselves for. And Carlo is somebody who is attracting the attention of the younger generations. So not only is he called the first millennial, saint, he's the first one born in that era of the 90s, the late 80s, early 90s, who's going to become a saint. He's also the first saint to have played on a PlayStation, and done Pokemon Go. His PlayStation, apparently my students have told me, there's memes that it's a considered a third class relic. So, so that all that is pretty extraordinary. But at the same time, it it's something that we've always done. We've always done with really big saints, that they speak to our generation, they speak to our issues that we have, that we see relevance in them, and they can help guide us just through their story, through their person, through visiting them. They can help change interior, like you said, change our interior journey and make it stronger towards that city of God.
So on the 27th, what will happen? We decided to record this episode so that it would be released and accessible in preparation for, well, the week leading up to this. What's going to happen on the 27th?
So there's a canonization mass of ceremony that should be led by the Pope. I mean, he is sick, but he's getting better. It should be in St. Peter's, but they're going to have it simultaneously in Assisi. And they will, declare him a saint. They will talk about his virtues. This is where his narrative becomes solidified, kind of for all time. So there's oftentimes lots of different conflicting views. I'm seeing some skeptical things coming up recently about Carlos, saying some of the kids that he grew up with were like, nobody said he was necessarily any holier than anybody else or something like that, but then others do. And so, it all gets evened out. There's going to be these in basically the the Book of Saints, basically. And it's going to be the message and the declaration and the address that the Pope gives about this saint. That's going to be the narrative. And like I said, with Padre Pio, it's hard to change, but it can change over time, right? The narrative with Padre Pio, it didn't say anything about the stigmata. Pope John Paul II had said he was always immersed in supernatural realities, and that was it, right? But it was more about his obedience and the story of his suffering, being obedient to the church, being obedient to God despite torments by the devil, torments with this suffering. With Carlo, we're going to hear, I think, a lot about him being an ordinary person, just like us, and dealing with the problems that we deal with today. That he's really a saint for our time. He's a saint for an internet generation, a generation that is seeking refuge online, but also knowingly getting psychological stresses from being online. I mean, there's literally stories about Carlo saying that he limited himself, even though he played PlayStation, he limited himself for 1 hour a day because he didn't want to get addicted. I mean, these are like things that I tell my kids, right? Like,
Pediatricians out there are going to
right.
be using this as another layer of
Yeah,
support for their positions.
exactly. So, it's I think we're going to see a lot about him being an average person that has extraordinary faith to God. And that means that we all can have, we all as average people can also have extraordinary faith to God. We all can be present in this world. We all can use technologies to further the faith-based mission of the church. I think that's something that obviously is very clear with Carlo, that he was a computer programmer, but all the stuff that he programmed were Catholic websites. He used it to help further devotion for the church, and that's really important, right? This generation, they're bombarded with a lot of both frivolous and even some very non-good religiously considered content out there, non-positive content out there. There's a lot of also bullying and things like that that go on online. And so to say, hey, you know, it's okay to use the internet. You can't fight it anymore, but you have to use it, model your actions on the internet and your use of the internet to the ways that Carlo did that as well. And I think that that's a really super modern message from a very old church, but it's not. It's in line with the way that we've always been adapting to change in the 2000 plus year history of the church.
The concept of hope and the concept of virtuous internet use or virtuous conduct in virtual spaces are two important points you've highlighted. Are there any other points that you think are salient in terms of why the Catholic Church chose this particular young man at this point in history to focus on?
So I mean, I think the really big thing here is that we need a saint, or the Catholic Church needs a saint who can really speak to the present generation. This is a the Catholic Church since the turn of the millennium has been dealing with a lot of problems in terms of numbers, in terms of uh, the faithful leaving, scandals, things like that. It's no secret, and it's not a criticism of the church. When Pope Benedict was still Cardinal Ratzinger, he gave a speech around the turn of the millennium saying that he was predicting a smaller, leaner church. Those are the words: smaller and leaner church. What that means is that he knew, right, with all of the issues of modernization, uh, problems that were just starting to bubble up with clerical abuse scandals and things like that. There was also like economic issues going on as well with the church. He said, "Look, the church of the new millennium is going to be smaller, but leaner. Leaner is like healthier, right? Like it's the fringes, are going to fall away, but what we're going to be left with is smaller, but hopefully it can be also like tighter, more faithful." And that's kind of interesting, and that has carried through with with Pope Francis as well. That you know to draw in people to as the older generation is aging out. The generation of Padre Pio are passing away, aging out. You need to bring in a newer generation. That newer generation has a lot of things, just like every generation, but a lot of things going on and a lot of things again, like going contrary to bringing them into the church. So you need somebody like Carlo, a saint who they see themselves in him, and that is something that in the limited like newspaper articles and interviews with kids around the world, especially in Latin America, that these journalists have done. People say I can relate to him, right? I can see he looks like me. He looks like my generation. And what's funny is, of course, these are Gen Zs saying this about a millennial, because he's still 15, and so I think that it's important to bring in the new generation, but also to kind of bring them in a good way, in a positive way, in a strong, with strength and faith, kind of a way. Um, Unlike kind of I send my kids to Catholic school, right? And like just saying you go to school and you're Catholic and that's it. Have somebody that they really can see themselves in. And again, I've said this, but it's great that my field school is in the next town over from Assisi in Perugia. And even though we're not doing religion, we do like a food and heritage trip, for 5 weeks studying those. We go to Assisi, and my students, whether they're Catholic or not, they're like, wow, who is this kid? I see myself in him. I can relate to the stories. It's harder to relate to St. Francis from 800 plus years ago. Even Padre Pio, it's getting harder and harder to relate to somebody, who had the stigmata, who had I mean, this isn't what the present generation is dealing with. That past generation living through World War I and World War II and the Cold War, they needed these signs, right? That God is still present, especially against communism, against fascism, against these atheist, tendencies, that was so important to see the real physical manifestation of Jesus, having somebody channel Jesus. It's not the same right now. Now we need somebody, channeling the internet, and being able to say, look, I did this too. And if you can be playing, Halo, Fortnite, whatever, but also still direct your attention to God, to your faith, those two aren't incompatible. I think that's a really powerful statement. It's a very powerful message, and it can bring, a new generation to the church.
So as you look forward in your own life, personally and professionally, um, I mean, there are threads around Catholic identity and how you have fused that with your career as an anthropologist and a professor and researcher. Um, Padre Pio sort of set the stage for how to view uh, saints in the context of rituals and rites of passage and pilgrimages to sites and shrines that are important to those saints. You have experience with tourism and site management and kind of the group dynamics of how pilgrims move through spaces. All this comes together towards what for you?
I have no idea. No.
I want
What does
you
it come to?
how's it, where are you moving forward? What projects are you looking forward to, or new lines of research that, I mean, it seems like that Carlo Acutis, you could now be studying this saint for the rest of your career. I mean, you're already well positioned
Sure.
to offer a lot of expertise and help the rest of us understand why this person has been given this place within the Catholic Church, but also kind of what happens around the site where he's buried and how pilgrims are engaging now with that site.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in terms of Carlo, I mean, that is my newer line of research. I mean, I have written a little bit on him. I had a piece in the Conversation that was picked up by lots of Catholic and non-Catholic news outlets and translated into Portuguese and French and all that stuff. Um, I think it. I like to do these kinds of research projects that are long term, but that are also always related to each other. So I don't see a real difference, as we said earlier on, between my work in Cambodia with World Heritage Sites and tourism at Angkor Wat, um, and then transitioning to seeing how other kinds of big big name kind of changes for a town can revitalize a town without actually producing monetary goods. So that was that, Padre Pio thing. And then, Padre Pio himself was a revitalization of earlier devotional practices. And it was a way of appealing to newer generations and moving them towards the church, especially at the end of in the 1900s, 1990s, and the early 2000s. And even at that time, when they exhumed his body, and I was doing the most of my research living in Italy, and there were 6 million people. I mean, there was already, like, you knew this was kind of like the peak, and it's only downhill. When they built the new basilica, they put it with all the top artists. This is, and I wrote about it at the time, and I said, look, this is inevitably staving off this kind of entropy that happens with saints. That new saints come up and they supplant the devotion in the older saints. And it's really interesting because, and we're seeing this with Carlo right now, saints have a life cycle just like anybody else. There's only very few that are these like big saints that they continue, like Saint Francis, that they continue to operate in people's lives. But all these thousands of other saints, they get popular, and you see, if you believe it, but even if you don't, you see all these instances of graces and miracles and stories of people being touched by the saint. And then, that people stop praying to that saint. So then there's less of those things happening, those extraordinary graces or miracles happening, until they kind of almost get forgotten or they're not as popular anymore. But a new saint comes up, And Carlo's a new one, so it's nice that I got to kind of see and experience the Padre Pio movement as it really gained steam. And it's really awesome from an anthropological perspective, from an academic perspective, to see the Carlo movement, start from the beginning, and to see how that affects, the last really popular saint. When will we stop saying that Padre Pio is the most prayed to saint in these countries, in Italy, Ireland, the Philippines? I mean, has he already, you know, been aged out, those people, and now a new group of saints are coming up? I mean, that's probably what's going to happen. That doesn't mean, and that's the other thing. It doesn't mean that the saint is like, it's not real. If you believe it, there's no way we can verify. So as an anthropologist, I like to balance that. I mean, I'm not saying that this is real or not, or whatever, but certainly it doesn't suggest that the saint wasn't real to begin with, because now he's not operating anymore. He's on vacation. He's taking a rest, because basically what's happening is that, saints are saints for other people. We pray to them, we use them as models, and when they've kind of outlived the relevance, you know, new saint will come up, and that's why Carlo is unique for the specifics of his narrative and the time period he lives in, and everything else. But he's not unique in terms of we've always had saints that speak to the time that we see ourselves in, that we aspire to be like, and that the church kind of elevates to say, you should look to this person as a model. So that's where I'm going with that. I think it would be nice to see how long the momentum lasts. Again, I've been talking a lot about faith, and now I sound very whatever, dispassionately scientific or something. But certainly to see, will it last as long as Padre Pio? What is the effect on Padre Pio? What How will his narrative be contested or solidified? St. Carlo Acutis. Will he be moved into a different church? I think is a big one. I think it's really extraordinary to do a comparison on, these kinds of sites like San Giovanni Rotondo and Pietrelcina, which are really just sites of Padre Pio, of the saint. And then to go to, Carlo, who is buried asked to be buried in a town that does not need a new saint, that has already a lot of pilgrims and tourists coming there. What is that? What effect is it going to have? Is there a way of being modern, of modernizing? I mean, are they going to build like a basilica somewhere out in the outskirts of the town that would be just for him? I mean, he's buried in a church that was built for to commemorate a particular site and event of St. Francis. So what does that do to the Francis narrative? I mean, all those things are super interesting, and we really just need more time to kind of research it, to figure it out, and to see where it goes. Everything is always a process, and that's why I love anthropology. It's never done. It's not. We don't just give out a survey and we're done. We kind of follow it all the way as long as we can, and I'm excited to see where it takes my research.
Yeah, and to be doing your work in real time while the cult around this saint grows, as well as the practices at his tomb grow, as well as other sites that may be growing, because the whole area becomes more of a focal point in terms of
Mm-hmm.
pilgrimages.
Yeah, yeah. I just, again, I mean, to see it in real time, I think is a really extraordinary thing. I don't think, even though I just said that we do this in every generation, I don't know, mediated by the media and social media. I mean, this is blown up. So again, it's really one of the first huge saint movements that are on in new media, which I think is also a big thing. And we just have to see where that goes. I mean, like you said, we're seeing it in real time unfold, and how different groups are going to use it. What lessons the next saint, postulator for the cause of the next saint, how they're going to be using media, I think is really going to be interesting. I think it's also going to be interesting to just see, what happens at Assisi, again, like I'm seeing there's a downturn in the number of visitors at San Giovanni Rotondo, even. Is there some other saint that could be requested to be buried there, so bump it up again? Or how are those site managers going to be dealing with this change in demographics too? I mean, that's all to be seen. So
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this meandering conversation. I always learn a lot from you, and
thank you.
you've given me a lot to think about. And I imagine that people who are listening or watching this may want to get in touch with you because of your expertise in this area. How can they do that?
Sure. So, I mean, the easiest way is just, you can write me at michael@michaeldgiovine.com. So you can see the way my big long Italian name is written out, and do that. I have a website. If you Google me, you could come up with my websites through. Right now, it's through my institution. So wcupa.edu/Michael DiGiovine.
I'll
And
put them up. I'll put them up
yeah,
at the end.
and that would be that's great. And I would love to talk to people. Another thing that I've always done, and I've gotten some, again, anthropologically for research, it's been really interesting to have interviews of people who have written to me, and I could talk with them. But of course, if you just have questions, people have questions, and of a faith-based thing, I mean, that way I'm happy to talk with them too.
Awesome. I'll put your information at the end. Yeah, really, really appreciate you taking the time today to we decided to do this sort of quickly so that the information could be released in time for this event that's happening on the 27th. And so I think it's timely and relevant, and certainly appreciate your voice on the topic.